An old man solved in 1 second what 100 experts couldn't. Everyone was shocked. The sound of compressed air hissed from a far corner of the garage, blending with the rhythmic clinks of tools and occasional bursts of laughter from the engineering crew. Chrometech Garage wasn't your average repair shop. It was a sleek, high-tech facility in the heart of the city, where million-dollar vehicles were brought in for precision work, restoration, or complete overhauls. Every technician wore spotless uniforms, carried digital tablets, and worked beneath the glow of industrial LED lights suspended from steel beams. In the center of the garage sat a rare beast, a 1964 Falcon V8 pickup, imported from a private collection in the Midwest. Its rust had been polished into a burnished charm. The body had been repainted in a glossy hunter green, and custom parts had been installed with surgical precision. It looked perfect, but it didn't run, and no one could figure out why. "This truck is supposed to start," Emily said, tapping hard on her tablet. "The engine's rebuilt, the wiring is new, the computer is calibrated. There's no reason—" "It should be running," said Kyle, one of the younger technicians, scratching his head, "unless it's haunted or something." Emily didn't laugh. She was in her early 30s, sharp-jawed and sharper-tongued, known for her uncompromising standards. With an MIT degree framed in her office and years of experience under her belt, she had built her reputation on getting the impossible done. Today, though, the impossible wasn't cooperating. A quiet figure swept the far corner of the shop, pushing a wide broom in slow arcs along the floor. George wore a faded blue janitor's uniform, his name stitched in red thread on the chest. His white hair curled slightly under his cap, and his boots had decades of wear on them. He stopped near the truck, eyes resting on the Falcon like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. "Beautiful model," George said, barely above a murmur. "Seen a few of these in my time." Emily didn't look at him. Kyle did, and rolled his eyes. "Gorgeous and completely dead," Emily muttered. "And I'm not going to let a $10 million deal slip away because this thing suddenly wants to play dead." George hesitated, then stepped a little closer. "If I may, sometimes the ignition relay in these older V8s gets picky, especially with newer wiring. We've got it covered, George," Emily said sharply without turning. "Thanks." George gave a polite nod and returned to sweeping. From across the shop, Kyle chuckled. "Hey, maybe we should just hand the tablet over to George. I'm sure his mop has a diagnostic mode." A few other techs snickered. Emily smirked, but her eyes stayed locked on the engine readout. The day dragged on. Emily's team checked every system again. Spark, fuel, sensors, timing, all within spec. They updated software, reset calibrations, and even swapped out parts that didn't need replacing, just in case. Nothing worked. Emily's phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard, the shop's general manager. "Status, client's jet lands at 10 a.m. tomorrow." She didn't reply. George passed by again around 6 p.m., pushing his cart of cleaning supplies. The shop had quieted. Just Emily, Kyle, and 2 other engineers remained, arguing over a wiring diagram. George stopped again, this time looking directly into the open hood. "You tried isolating the ignition bypass circuit?" he asked gently. Emily turned to him, tired and short-tempered. "George," she said, voice low but firm, "I appreciate the thought, but we're professionals. There's a lot more to this than what you used to work on." George nodded. "Of course. Just thought it might save you a few hours," Kyle muttered. "Yeah, thanks, Grandpa." George didn't respond. He simply moved on. Behind him, Emily stared at the truck in frustration. She didn't want to admit it, but deep down, something about George's calm certainty annoyed her. Not because she thought he was wrong, but because she wasn't entirely sure he was. By 9 p.m. the garage was nearly empty. Emily sat alone with her notes spread out across a steel workbench. The hum of the lights above buzzed like a reminder of time slipping away. George was still there, mopping the far wall, silent as always. Emily's phone buzzed again. "We cannot miss this deal. This truck starts, or your name is on the next hiring ad." Richard. She clenched her jaw and threw her gloves onto the bench. The shop had every modern tool imaginable, but the old truck refused to come to life. She looked at the machine, at its elegant lines and stubborn heart. Then she glanced toward George, who had quietly sat down near the back of the garage, sipping from a thermos and watching the rain begin to tap against the windows. Less than 14 hours until the client arrived, and the Falcon was still dead. The early morning light spilled through the wide windows of Chrometech Garage, turning the rain-specked glass a pale gold. The Falcon sat in the center of the shop like a monument, silent, still, untouchable. Hours had passed, and it hadn't moved an inch. Emily stood at the workbench, dark circles under her eyes, her fingers gripping a coffee cup she couldn't remember making. Her team was already back, groggy but trying to look focused. None of them dared say it aloud, but every minute that passed made the job feel more impossible. "Diagnostics again," Emily ordered. "Top to bottom, every system." Kyle groaned. "We did that 3 times already." "Then do it a 4th, she snapped, "unless you have a better idea." Kyle shut up. Across the room, George arrived quietly, just like always. He pushed his cart in. Broom leaned neatly against the side, mop bucket full and ready. He nodded at the team, though only one of the junior techs nodded back. George's eyes fell on the truck. He stood still for a long moment, then walked slowly toward it, wiping his hands on a rag. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I know you've checked the electronics, but I'd really recommend testing the ignition coil ground. These old Falcons had a flaw. The wiring harness, sometimes pinched under the firewall after modern refits, causes a silent short." Emily turned her head without looking up from her tablet. "George, please. I don't have time to entertain stories from the 1970s. We're doing this by the book." "I'm just trying to help," George said. His voice held no bitterness. Kyle raised his eyebrows and grinned. "Actually, you know what? Let's try it. Come on, let's prove the floor guy wrong." Emily gave him a sharp look. "Don't waste your time, Kyle." But Kyle was already opening the hood. "I'll do a quick continuity test across the coil harness. If nothing shows, can we please stop pretending the janitor's advice is relevant?" He pulled the wiring loose a little more aggressively than needed, muttering under his breath. Emily ignored them and went back to her work. Then something sparked. A quick, loud snap, followed by a small wisp of smoke curling up from the wiring harness. Kyle cursed and yanked his hand back. "What the hell did you do?" Emily shouted, rushing over. I don't know. I just followed what he said." Kyle pointed at George. George stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "You pulled too far. That wire wasn't the problem. I said to test, not rip into it." "Oh, now you're the expert," Kyle sneered. Emily turned on George. "Enough. This is what happens when we listen to amateurs. You've done more harm than good." George's shoulders didn't move. He simply gave a small nod and stepped back, wiping his hands on the rag again. "I understand," he said quietly. Richard entered the garage just then, looking like he hadn't slept either. He took one glance at the scene and immediately sensed the tension. "What happened?" he asked, walking briskly toward them. "False lead," Emily said coldly. "We're still working on it." Richard didn't seem satisfied with the answer, but nodded. Then his phone buzzed. He read the message and stiffened. "The client's assistant just confirmed. They're 20 minutes out." The room fell silent. 20... Emily's voice faltered. "He bumped his schedule. Wants to see the truck before his meeting downtown." Richard looked at the Falcon, then at the team. "If this thing doesn't start when he walks in, we lose the sale." "We'll fix it," Emily said, her voice brittle. "We're close. Richard looked at her long and hard. I hope so. I really hope so. He turned and walked back to his office. As soon as he left, Kyle broke the silence. So what now, boss? Emily didn't answer. She stared at the Falcon, chest rising and falling faster than before. The pressure was louder than the buzz of the lights or the ticking of the shop clock. She could feel it pressing on her from every angle. She walked quickly to her office, slammed the door behind her, and dropped into the chair. The room was small, surrounded by glass on three sides. She could still see the Falcon from her seat, and beyond it George, quietly organizing his tools at the far wall. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her messages. Her last conversation with Richard stared back at her. "This truck starts, or your name is on the next hiring ad." Emily let the phone drop onto the desk and buried her face in her hands. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had the degree, the credentials, the experience. She'd built her career on competence, on proving people wrong, especially people who thought she wasn't qualified to lead. And now? Now she was about to lose it all because of a piece of metal that refused to turn over. Outside, George quietly mopped a corner of the floor, careful not to cross into the workspace. His eyes flicked toward the Falcon every so often, and though his face was calm, there was something behind his gaze. Something patient, knowing, almost sad. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone who had seen this all before. The digital clock on the shop wall ticked past 9:42 a.m. In exactly 18 minutes, a black luxury sedan would roll into Chrome Tech's lot, carrying a man worth more than the entire block. And he'd expect to see a working 1964 Falcon, the Falcon that still wouldn't start. Emily stood near the hood, lips pressed tightly together, her fingers wrapped around a diagnostic scanner that had long since run out of answers. She was on her fourth coffee and her third mental breakdown. She hadn't slept, neither had anyone else. But the truck was still dead. Richard marched across the garage floor, his footsteps loud and deliberate. He didn't slow as he approached Emily. "What's the status?" he asked. Emily didn't answer at first. Richard's voice dropped. "Emily." She exhaled through her nose. "No change." "No change," he repeated. "We've had over a week, a top-tier team, and no one can get it to turn over. I don't know what the issue is. I've gone through I don't want excuses." His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to turn heads across the garage. "If this truck doesn't start when that client walks in, this shop loses its biggest deal of the year, and you," he pointed a finger, "are off this project, possibly off my payroll." Emily stared at him, stunned. From behind a tool rack, Kyle muttered, "Maybe someone else should be leading this." Emily turned to him. "What did you say?" Kyle stepped forward, shrugging. "Look, I'm just saying, we've tried everything. Maybe if you weren't so busy shutting everyone down, including the old guy who actually offered help, we wouldn't be in this mess." Her eyes flashed. "You're blaming me for your screw-up. Hey, you're the boss, right? Isn't that where the blame goes?" Tension sparked like static in the air. George stood silently nearby, pushing his mop along the edge of the garage floor. He paused, looking at the Falcon, then at Emily, then at Richard. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Richard noticed. He stepped over to George, his face tight with frustration. You said something yesterday, didn't you?" George met his gaze. "Yes, sir. I've seen this model before. I believe I know what the issue is." Richard looked back toward the others, then at the Falcon. He checked his watch. "Do it." Emily's head snapped around. "What?" Richard didn't even glance at her. "George, try it. Now. You're letting him—" Emily stepped forward, incredulous. "He's not even trained. This is reckless." "What's reckless," Richard snapped, "is losing a 7-figure deal because your pride is bigger than your results." Emily stood frozen, fuming but powerless. George walked to the Falcon slowly, like it was a sacred object. He didn't ask for tools. He didn't consult a manual. He simply placed his hand on the hood and leaned in. The others watched in silence as he gently adjusted a set of cables near the firewall. Nothing aggressive, nothing that sparked or smoked, just steady, practiced hands making precise movements. He tightened one small connection under the ignition harness. Then he reached into the cab and turned the key. There was a beat of silence. Then the Falcon rumbled to life. The deep, guttural growl of the V8 engine filled the garage, smooth and powerful, like it had never once refused to start. For a full 5 seconds, no one spoke. Then Kyle's mouth dropped open. One of the junior techs let out a stunned, "No way." Emily stared at the truck. Disbelief etched across her face. She looked like someone watching their whole reality shatter in real time. Richard exhaled, hands on his hips, shaking his head in stunned relief. Then, from outside, the soft sound of a car door closing. The client had arrived. He stepped into the garage, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and dark sunglasses. He paused as the sound of the engine washed over him. "That her?" he asked, grinning. "She sure is," Richard replied, walking toward him. "And she's running like a dream." The client approached the Falcon, eyes gleaming. "Now that is a sound I haven't heard in decades." He turned toward the team. "Who brought her to life?" George, now wiping grease from his hands with an old rag, stood quietly beside the hood. Richard hesitated, then pointed. "He did." The client blinked. "The janitor." "His name's George," Richard corrected. The client walked over to him and extended a hand. "Well, George, looks like you just saved my morning." George smiled modestly and shook his hand. "Just fixed what needed fixing." Emily stood in the background, her arms crossed, face unreadable. George glanced her way, gave her a small nod, then turned back to his cart. The engine continued to purr behind him as he quietly resumed his work. Not a hero in his eyes, just a man who knew what he was doing. And for the first time in 2 days, the garage was filled with something it had sorely lacked: respectful silence. The Falcon purred like a lion tamed. Its engine hummed with perfect timing, the hood still open, revealing the handiwork that brought it back to life. The client circled the truck slowly, his polished shoes echoing across the garage floor. He stopped by the driver's side and placed his hand gently on the door. "It's perfect," he said. "This is exactly what I was hoping for." Richard stood beside him, smiling wide, riding the high of a deal saved. "We put a lot of hours into it. Team effort top to bottom." The client raised an eyebrow. "That right? Because I was told it didn't run until 5 minutes ago." Richard hesitated. "Well, yes, we had a few last-minute breakthroughs." The client turned back toward the team. "So who fixed it?" George had already stepped back from the truck, arms folded behind his back, standing near his mop bucket like he always did. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The client pointed toward him. "That man." Richard looked uncomfortable. "He's part of the support staff." "Support staff," the client repeated, eyes narrowing. "He fixed the engine. Not your engineers, not your lead technician. Him." Richard cleared his throat. "Yes." George spotted something the rest of us missed. "George," the client said, walking over. He extended his hand again. "Thank you. You just saved me a whole trip and possibly saved them a whole company." George shook his hand gently. "Just did what I could." The client smiled. "I own a vintage restoration shop out west. Top end, full service. We need someone like you. I'll double whatever you're making here. Full benefits, relocation, everything. You'd have your own team." George didn't hesitate. "That's kind of you, sir, but I'm happy right where I am." The client blinked. "You're turning it down?" George nodded. "I like my routine. I like working with my hands. And I like being the quiet guy in the corner until someone needs help." The client laughed. "Well, damn, we could use more men like you." Richard, standing nearby, quickly jumped in. "George, you've been with us a long time. I've clearly underestimated your skills. If you'd like to move into a technical role, or maybe a management position—" "I appreciate that," George said, "but I'm not interested in titles. I like what I do." Richard was speechless. The client looked around, still intrigued. "All right then. Tell me, how did you know what was wrong with the truck? No one else could figure it out." George chuckled lightly. "That falcon, I recognized the sound it didn't make." The client raised an eyebrow. "Years ago, back in my 20s, I worked at a small repair shop. We had a fleet of those falcons, delivery trucks beat to hell, always overheating or shorting out. One day, one of them wouldn't start. The wiring had been replaced by someone who didn't know the quirks of the original harness. I spent 2 days chasing the problem before I found a crimped ground wire under the dash." He paused, eyes on the truck. "This one?" Same model, same hesitation, same missing click when the key turned. "Some things you don't forget." The client nodded slowly. "Experience can't teach that in a classroom." George smiled. "No, sir. You earn it." Across the shop, Emily stood stiffly near her desk, arms crossed tightly. Kyle leaned on a toolbox nearby, avoiding eye contact. Richard walked toward them, jaw set. "Emily, Kyle, I need to speak with both of you, now." No one had to hear what was said. They didn't need to. The tone was clear, and so was the outcome. When Richard returned minutes later, only George remained near the Falcon, wiping down the edge of the fender with a clean rag. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to leave it just right. The client gave one last nod of gratitude and walked out, his phone already pressed to his ear as he called someone to arrange payment and pickup. Richard followed him, eager to lock in the deal. And just like that, the garage returned to silence. George walked slowly back across the floor. He picked up his broom, the same broom he'd pushed every day for nearly a decade. He began sweeping again, not for show, not because anyone asked him to, but because the job wasn't finished. He passed a pair of younger techs whispering in the corner. They didn't mock him this time. One of them even gave a nod. George nodded back. Most of the shop carried on without much notice, the day rolling forward like any other. But for those who had truly watched what happened, those who had seen George step forward when no one else could, something had shifted. They'd remember, not because he asked them to, but because quiet strength, when finally seen, leaves a mark that arrogance never could.